People still ask me why he did it. They come down the causeway at low water when the marks are showing, the way folk have always come to Cold Hall, and somewhere between the weather and the channel they get around to it. They ask it carefully, the way you test a board you weren't sure would hold your weight. Why would a man like that, a Corod man, an old keeper with a registry name and a clean house, take in a thing the whole coast had agreed was vermin? Why would he stand between it and the warden's writ? Why would he sign? I tell them what he told the registry man, which was nothing. I tell them he kept what the tide brought in because he was the keeper of it, and that was the whole of his answer, and he never offered another. Most of them go away unsatisfied. They wanted a wound to point at, a dead child of his own, a guilt he was paying off, a softness in him from some old sorrow. They wanted a reason that would let them keep believing nobody does a thing like that without a reason. I have nothing to give them. I knew the man 40 years and I never found the seam they were looking for. There wasn't one. He was just made the way he was made, and the way he was made was that when something cold came into his channel he warmed it, and when the law came to take it he stood in the doorway, and that was that. I am the thing he took in. I should say that plainly so there is no mistaking who is talking. I was the marsh-born he pulled out of the weir lines the spring I was small, and I am the keeper of Cold Hall now, and I have rung the same bell over the same water for longer than he had it. So when I tell you what he was, understand I am the most partial witness you could find. But I am also the only one left who was in the room, and a partial witness who was in the room is worth more than a fair one who was up the causeway in a warm bed, which is where the fair ones were. Let me tell it from the drown. You have to understand the drown to understand any of it. Twice a year the deep tide comes up the rack, the long flat country of mud and reed and sunk causeway that lies below Hesk, where the river loses its mind and spreads out to die in the sea. The rack is a drowned place even on its best day, a country that can't decide if it's land or water and settles the argument fresh every 6 hours. The keeper's whole work is the channel, the one true road of deep water that lets the ferry barges cross from Hesk down to the salt ports without going aground or going into the soft mud, which takes a barge slow and does not give it back. The keeper rings the bells that mark the channel's turns and tends the channel marks, the withies and the painted stakes, and at night he shows the lamps. A barge master coming up the rack in fog steers by Cold Hall's bell the way a man in the dark steers by the one light he trusts. That is the work. It is not glorious work. It is the kind of work that nobody notices is being done right, and everybody notices the one time it is done wrong. And the one time it is done wrong, a barge goes into the mud with 40 souls and a season's grain, and the rack keeps all of it. Old Renick had been the keeper at Cold Hall longer than most of Hesk had been alive. He'd come from somewhere up the coast that he never named and didn't visit, and he kept the station, the way other men keep a grudge, completely, and without explaining it to anyone. He had no wife that anyone knew of and no child, and the people of Hesk had long ago decided he was a sour old solitary who liked the company of bells better than the company of his own kind, and they were not entirely wrong, only they had the cause and the effect turned around. He didn't keep to the station because he was sour. He'd gone a little sour because he kept to the station, and the station was the kind of post that made a man into whatever he already mostly was, only more of it. The high drown the year I was small came in hard. The marsh-born know it before the Corod do. We feel it down the rib slits, a pressure off the deep water, a change in the salt, and the broods scatter ahead of it. I should explain this part too, because it is the part that everyone gets wrong, the part the Corod never understood and used against us. The marsh-born don't keep our young the way the settled people keep theirs. We are a scattered people by our making. The drown comes and the broods break apart and ride it out wherever the water carries each small one, and afterward, if the small one has the sense and the luck, it works its way back to the warm shallows where the others gather, and it is folded back in, no questions, no kin counting, because among us there is no such thing as the wrong child to take in. A small one is a small one. The water brought it. You keep it. I did not have the luck. The drown carried me wrong, out of the warm shallows and down the deep, into the false channel where the mud current runs, and a small one in the mud current does not come back to the shallows. A small one in the mud current goes out to the salt and is not seen again. Except the mud current at its turning runs hard against the timbers of Coldhall's weir, the fish weir Renick kept for his own pot, and I went into the weir lines the way a fish goes into them, tangled and turning and out of air, and I would have drowned there in the keeper's fish trap if the keeper had been a different man. He came down at first light to lift the weir, the way he did every morning of his life, and he found a thing in it. Not a fish. A small thing, gray-green and webbed and gone limp, hung up in the lines with its dark eyes filmed over, and its rib slits gone the dark flushed color we go when the fear has used us all up. He told me about it once, years on, the only time he ever spoke of that morning. He said he stood there a moment with the weir line in his hand and the cold water at his knees, and he thought, plainly, that is one of the marsh vermin, and it is dead in my trap, and I will cut it loose, and let the tide take it, because that is what a man does with a thing that is dead and not his. He said he had his knife already at the line. And then he said, and this is the only piece of an answer he ever gave me, and I have turned it over 40 years and it has never worn smooth. Then he said the small thing's hand closed. Just barely. A web of cold gray fingers around 2 of the weir cords, the smallest possible holding on, the kind of grip a body keeps after the mind has gone out of it, not asking for anything, just holding the way the made to hold on. And I am not such a man, he said, as can cut loose a thing that's still holding. That was the whole of it. He never made it more than that, and he was angry in his cold way the few times anyone tried to make it more than that for him. He didn't cut me loose. He cut the lines and lifted the whole tangle of weir and small drowned thing up out of the cold and carried it into the station, and he laid it by the iron stove, and he did the things you do, the pressing and the turning and the warming, the things a keeper knows, because a keeper is always pulling cold, half-drowned things out of the water, only they are usually men. And the cold gray thing coughed up the rack and breathed, and its rib slits came slow back from the dark flushed color toward the soft gray of a thing not actively dying, and its dark eyes cleared and found the fire, and then found the man and went wide. He told me I looked at him, that first time, the way a thing looks at the jaws that have it. I don't remember it. I remember almost nothing of the small years. We don't, much. The drown takes the early memory the way it takes everything else, and what I have of that morning I have from his telling, but I believe him about the look. I have seen that look since. In other small ones I have pulled out of other weirs in my turn, and there is nothing in this world like the look of a marsh-born small one who has woken warm in the house of a Korod, and is waiting with its whole body to learn whether the warmth is the kind that comes before being killed or the kind that comes before being kept. We have both kinds in our history. We had learned to wait and see. What he did that first morning was the thing that decided the rest of it, though neither of us knew yet that anything was being decided. He didn't reach for me. A man who means to keep a frightened thing knows not to reach for it. He set down a tin cup of the warm marsh tea he brewed off the chicory root, the bitter brown brew he drank all day, and he set down beside it a square of dry wool off his own shoulder, and then he went back to his work at the far side of the station and let me be. He gave me the warmth and the dry and the space, and he gave me his back, which is the deepest thing a body can give a frightened creature, the turned and unworried back that says, I am not watching to see what you'll do, because I have already decided you'll be all right. And after a long time, when the fire had done its work and the man had truly not moved toward me once, I took up the wool and I drank the bitter brew, and that, I think, was the morning I became his, though it took the rest of the coast a year to understand it had happened and a warden to try to undo it. He should have handed me up the causeway. I want to be clear about the law, because the law is the whole weight of this, and a man who breaks a clean law from a soft heart is a different thing from a man who breaks a wicked one, and Renick was the second kind, and it cost him to be. Under Korad law, a marshborn had no standing in itself. We were unclaimed, wild-born, houseless, registered to no name, and in the careful language of the clearance writs, we were not persons but feral increase, the way they'd speak of mice in a granary or weed in a field. A person under that law was a thing registered to a house. We registered to no house, kept no houses, and so we were no persons, and a thing that is no person can be cleared like weed lawfully by a man with a writ. And after every drown a man with a writ came down into the rack and cleared us, the small ones that hadn't made it back to the deep shallows, the strays, the ones caught in the open mud where the clearing was easy. It was sold to Hesk as cleanliness. The drown brings up vermin, the warden clears it, the channel stays sweet. People who would not have hurt a thing themselves slept easier knowing the warden had been down to do it for them, and did not ask too closely what it was, because to ask closely would have been to learn that the vermin held on with its hand when it was dying, and nobody in a warm bed up the causeway wanted to learn that. So the lawful thing, the clean thing, the thing any other keeper on that coast would have done without a second's grief, was to send word up to Hesk that a stray had come into the station, and have the warden come down and clear it, and then lift the weir clean the next morning and go on. Rennick knew the law. He had lived under it his whole keeping. He did not send the word. He didn't make a speech of it. That wasn't in him. He just didn't send the word, the way a man doesn't send a word he has decided not to send, and the days went by, and the small gray thing by his stove got stronger and bolder, and at some point, without either of them marking the day, it stopped being a thing he hadn't yet handed up and became a thing in his house. He named me that first season. The marshborn don't name our small ones, there's no point. Among a people the drown will scatter again, but Rennick was a Korad, and a Korad cannot abide a nameless thing in his house. It offends something in them. And so one evening, watching me work a knot loose with my webbed fingers, he said, out of nowhere, "Wren." Just the one word. There was a marsh bird by that name up his old coast, he said, a small drab thing, nothing to look at, that wintered out the worst weather when the showy birds all fled south, and lived where bigger birds would starve, and was, he said, the toughest small nothing he'd ever known. He looked at me a while after he said it, the way he looked at the channel of an evening reading it. "Wren," he said again, settling it. "And it's settled. I have been Wren for 40 years. It is on the registry in his own hand. I will tell you about the registry. But first the season, because the season is the part that matters and the part nobody asks about. They ask about the drama, the warden, the writ, the standing in the doorway. Nobody asks about the season, and the season is where the thing was actually made. He taught me the channel. He didn't set out to, he set out to keep me out from underfoot. But a small one underfoot at Cold Hall learns the channel the way a small one in a smithy learns the fire, by being where it is. He'd take me out in the flat skiff at low water to tend the marks, and I'd ride in the bow. And he'd name the marks as we passed them, the withies and the painted stakes, the bell buoys, the drowned post off the second turn that he called the old man and steered wide of. And I learned them the way you learn the inside of the house you grow up in, without ever deciding to. And somewhere in that season, the teaching ran backward, and I started to give him something he didn't have. And that was the thing that made the coast's argument about me come apart, though the coast was too set in its argument to notice. We read water. It is the one thing we are made for, and the settled people are not. A marsh-born small one can feel a false channel from a true one down its rib slits, before a Korad keeper can see it with his eyes and his marks and his long experience. The mud current that nearly killed me, I could feel it after I was strong, feel exactly where the deep true water gave way to the soft killing mud. Feel it the way you feel a cold draft find the back of your neck. And I'd put my hand on his arm in the skiff and turn it the right way before he'd seen the reason. And at first he'd grumble and correct our course back. And then one foggy morning he didn't correct it. He followed my hand into water he couldn't read, and it came up true. And after that he followed my hand. An old keeper of 40 years, the best on that coast, started letting a marsh-born small one tell him where the channel ran, because the marsh-born small one was right, and he was a man who cared more about being right than about who was right, which is rarer in a man than you'd think. That was the season. The fog mornings, the marks, the bitter brew, the iron stove, the old man's back turned and unworried, my hand on his arm in the skiff. That was the whole of what we were before the warden came, and it was enough of a life that I would have been content to live it out and never have a story anyone came down the causeway to ask about. But the drown comes twice a year, and after the drown the warden comes, and the warden came. His name was Sarn, and he was not a cruel man, which is the part that took me years to be able to say. I wanted him to be cruel. It would have been easier to carry if he'd been cruel. He was worse than cruel. He was a decent man doing a wicked thing and not feeling it as wicked, because the law had filed the wickedness away under cleanliness, and he had never once in his life been made to open the file. He had a wife in Hesk and children he was kind to and a fair name, and he came down into the rack after every drown with his writ and his clearing poles and his 2 quiet men, and he cleared the unclaimed, and he went home and ate his supper and did not dream about it, because what he had cleared had not been persons. The law said so, and Sarn was a man who believed the law the way other men believe the weather, as a thing simply true and not up to him. He came up to the station that autumn after the second drown in the ordinary way, to ask the keeper if the drown had left anything in his weirs or his channel that wanted clearing, the way he'd asked Rennick every season for years, and Rennick had always said no, because before me there'd been nothing to say yes about. And this year Sarn came up the causeway and into the station to ask his ordinary question, and there I was by the iron stove. I remember this part. This is the first thing I remember whole, not from his telling but from my own eyes, the warden in the doorway with the autumn light behind him, and the smell that came off him that I knew before I knew anything, the salt and tar smell of the clearing poles, and my rib slits going dark down my sides before my mind had even named what I was afraid of, the body knowing the warden before the child did. I went still the way we go still. And Sarn looked at me by the stove, a marsh-born small one warm in a Korod keeper's house, wearing a square of the keeper's own wool, and his decent ordinary face did a thing I have seen since on the faces of decent ordinary men finding a fact that doesn't fit their file. It went blank, and then it went careful. "Keeper," he said, "you've got an unclaimed in your house." And Rennick, who had been mending a withy at the table and did not get up, said, "I've got wren in my house." I have thought about those 2 sentences more than I have thought about any other words I ever heard. The whole of it is in those 2 sentences. Sarn said an unclaimed, which is a category, a thing the law has a poll for. And Rennick said wren, which is a name, which is a person, which is a thing the law's poll cannot touch, except I wasn't yet, not on the registry, not where it counted, and Sarn knew it and Rennick knew it. And the autumn light came in the doorway and the warden's writ was in his coat, and we all 3 knew that a name spoken in a station is not the same as a name signed in the registry at Hesk, and that the difference between them was my whole life. Sarn was patient about it. That was the worst of him, the patience. He didn't reach for a pole. He explained the law to Rennick the way you'd explain it to a man who'd gone a little simple in his old age, a man who'd let a stray get under his skin and didn't see clearly what it was. He said the marsh-born were feral increase, and the drown had scattered them, and his writ ran over all the unclaimed in the rack, and a stray kept in a keeper's station was still a stray, no matter the keeper had got fond, and that he'd give Rennick till he came back up the causeway at week's end to settle his feelings, because he was not a hard man and he knew an old solitary could get strange notions about a pet, and then he'd come back and clear it, lawful and quiet. And Rennick would feel foolish for a season and then forget it, the way you forget a stray dog. He said it kindly. He even, at the door, said he was sorry for it and meant it, and that was the thing I have never forgiven and never quite been able to hate him for either, that he was sorry, and went home and slept. Rennick said nothing while the warden spoke. He mended his withy, and when Sarn was gone down the causeway, Rennick sat a while at the table with the mended withy in his hands, not looking at me, looking at the water out the window where the marks were going under with the rising tide. He was an old man and he had no standing. Understand that. He could not fight a warden and a writ with his fists. He'd have been put down himself and me cleared anyway. He had no kin in Hesk to call on, no name with the registrymen beyond a keeper's name, no money to speak of, nothing the warden wanted or feared. He was one old solitary at the end of a sunk causeway, and the whole settled weight of the coast and its clean law was on the other side of the argument, and the argument was about whether a thing it had agreed was Vermin would be alive at week's end. By every measure that men measure these things by, he had already lost. He knew it. I watched him know it, sitting at the table with the tide coming up over the marks. And then he did the thing. He didn't do it with a speech, and he didn't do it with a weapon. He did it with his coat and his hat and the flat skiff, the next registration day, which fell 2 days before the warden was due back. Registration day was the day the registrymen at Hesk sat to enter births and deaths, and the buying and selling of houses, and the settling of estates, the ordinary clerkwork of a settled people keeping track of who its persons were. Renick had not been up to a registration day in years. He had nothing to register, a solitary keeper with no births and no deaths and no house but the station, which was the coast's and not his. He took the flat skiff up the channel at low water, and he took me with him, wrapped in the wool against the eyes of Hesk, and he walked into the registry house at Hesk on registration day, and he stood in the line of farmers settling land and merchants settling debts, an old keeper with a marsh-born small one in his arms. And when he came to the table he set me on it in front of the registryman, and he said the words that ended it. I'll tell you the words. I have them exact because he made me learn them years later, so that I would know how it was done if ever I had to do it myself, which I have more than once, and each time I have said his words and not my own. He said, I'm here to register a birth into my house. The child is named Wren. The house is Cold Hall, registered to Renick Keeper. I'm the householder and I'm claiming the child to my name and standing surety for it under the law, and I'll sign it. The registryman, who was a young one and had never seen the like, looked at the gray-green webbed thing on his table and looked at the old keeper, and started to say the obvious thing, the thing everyone knew, that the creature was a marsh-born and marsh-born were unclaimed feral increase, and could not be registered to a house because they were not, and Renick stopped him. Not loud. He just laid his finger on the open page of the registry, on the empty line, and he said, Show me the law that says a householder can't claim a child into his own house and stand surety for it. Show me where it's written that I can't. I'll wait while you find it. And the registryman couldn't find it, because it wasn't there. The law had built its whole clean machine on a thing it had never thought to forbid, because it had never once imagined a Korod would do it. The law had made us unclaimed and cleared the unclaimed, and it had simply never written down and no person may claim one, because the unthinkable doesn't get a law against it. The unthinkable gets left as a gap, and the gap is where Renick walked. A householder could claim a child into his house and stand surety for it. That was old law, written for a man taking in his dead brother's orphan, written for kindness between Korod, and nobody had ever thought to bar the door against its being used for a marshborn, because nobody had ever thought a marshborn would be standing in the doorway with a man willing to sign. And once it was claimed, once it was registered to a house and a householder stood surety, it was a person under the law, a person with a name and a house and a standing, and a warden's clearing writ ran over the unclaimed and not 1 inch further. A claimed child was not unclaimed. The pole could not touch it. The whole machine ran on the one assumption that no one would ever claim us, and Renick broke the machine by being the one who did. He signed it. His name is on that line in his own hand, Renick, Keeper, Cold Hall, and under it, in the registryman's hand because I could not yet hold a pen, the name Wren, child of that house. I have seen the page. It is still in the Hesk registry. I have stood in front of it as a grown keeper, and put my webbed hand flat on the cold glass they keep it under now, on the line where an old man wrote his name to make me a person. And I will not tell you what that is like because there are no words on my side of it for what that is like. Sarn came back up the causeway at week's end with his writ and his clearing poles and his 2 quiet men, the way he'd said he would, and Renick met him at the door of the station with the registry paper in his hand, and he did not say a clever thing or a cruel thing. He just held out the paper and let the warden read it. And I watched a decent, ordinary man read a paper that took a lawful clearing out of his hands, and I watched his face do the thing again, the going blank and the going careful. Only this time there was something under it I hadn't seen on it before, a kind of trouble, because a writ that runs over feral increase and not over a registered child is a writ that has just been made to draw a line down the middle of a thing the warden had always seen as one undivided vermin. And a man cannot draw that line and go on not thinking about it. If a Marshbourne claim to a house is a person, then a Marshbourne is a thing that can be a person. And if it can be a person, then what exactly had the warden been clearing all those quiet seasons after all the drowns, going home after to his supper and his kind wife and his children he was good to? Renick handed him that question with the paper, and there was no clearing pole that could put it down. Sarn read the paper twice. Then he folded it and gave it back, and he looked at me a long moment by the stove. I had not gone dark this time. I had learned in a week that I was a person, and a person does not flush dark for a man who can't touch it, and he said only, "It's in order." And he took his 2 quiet men and his clearing poles, and he went back down the causeway. And as far as I ever learned, he never cleared in the rack again, though whether that was the paper or the question I could not tell you. Some seasons later the clearing writs stopped coming down from Hesk altogether, quietly, the way a wrong thing sometimes stops when too many people have been made to look at the seam of it, and I would like to tell you Renick's one signature did that, but the truth is I don't know what did it, and the old man would have spat at me for claiming a credit I couldn't prove. He paid for it. I won't pretend he didn't, because the asking folk always want the part where he paid, as if the cost were the proof. The cost was real, and it was small and grinding, and it lasted the rest of his life. Hesk went cold on him. A keeper depends on the goodwill of the barge masters and the ferry trade and the town that supplies him. And the town that supplied him had decided, in the way towns decide, that old Renick had done an unnatural thing, had brought a Marshbourne into a Corrod house and called it a child. And there is no quicker way to make a settled people cold than to make them look at a thing they've been comfortable about and see it different. They didn't run him off. You can't run off the keeper. The channel needs him. They just went cold, the small daily cold of short measures, and turned backs in the long way round. Barge masters who'd taken his bell on trust for 30 years started carrying their own marks. The supply skiff came late and left fast. Children up the causeway were told not to go down to Cold Hall, where the old man kept his vermin. He bore it the way he bore weather. He'd made his choice at the registry table, and a man who's made his choice doesn't spend the rest of his life flinching at the bill for it. But he was lonelier at the end than he'd been at the start, and he'd started lonely, and I have carried that I cost him the warmth of his own people, that the price of my being a person was charged to the one man who decided I was one. Though I think I have to believe, having known him, that he didn't reckon it a loss. He had the bells and the channel and the marks, and he had a Marshbourne small one who could read the false water down her rib slits and put her hand on his arm in the fog and turn the skiff into water he couldn't see. And he had, at the end of his life, a thing he'd lacked at the start of it, which was a person in his house who was alive because he'd kept holding the line. I think that was a fair trade to him. I never heard him say so. He wasn't a man who said so. But I rang the bell over him when he died, and the whole rack heard it, and I have rung it over the water every day of the 40 years since, and I think if he could hear the bell he'd reckon the account square, because the bell is the work, and the work goes on, and the Marshbourne keeper of Cold Hall learned the work from the man who claimed her, and that is as close to a monument as a keeper gets or wants. I do the registry now. That's the part I'll end on because it's the part that's mine and not his, The part where the thing he did stopped being a thing one strange old man did once and became a thing that happens at Cold Hall whenever the water brings a small one in. The drowned still comes twice a year. It still scatters the broods and carries the unlucky ones down the mud current into the weir, and I still lift the weir at first light the way he did, and some mornings there's a small gray thing in it, hung up in the lines, gone dark down its sides, holding on with the smallest possible grip the way the made to hold on. And I do what he did. I warm it and I dry it and I turn my back and give it the space, and when it's strong I name it, and on the next registration day I wrap it against the eyes of Hesk, and I take the flat skiff up the channel and I stand in the line at the registry house, a marsh-born keeper with a marsh-born small one in my arms, and I set the small one on the table and I say his words exact, the way he made me learn them. I'm here to register a birth into my house. And I sign it. I can hold the pen now. I sign it in my own hand, on the line, under the house of Cold Hall, and the small one is a person, and no pole made will touch it. And that is the whole of the answer to the question they come down the causeway to ask. They still ask it. 40 years and they still come down at low water and get around carefully to why. Why did he do it? Why would a Korod keeper claim a marshborn he found in his fish weir, a thing the whole coast had agreed was vermin? Why would he bear the cost? Why would he sign? And I tell them what he told the registry man, which was nothing, that he kept what the tide brought in because he was the keeper of it. And when they go away unsatisfied, wanting the wound to point at, I let them go. But I'll give you the truer answer since you've read this far, the one I never give the asking folk because they couldn't carry it and you maybe can. There wasn't a reason. That's the answer. They want a reason because a reason would let them off. A reason would mean he was special, marked by some old grief, and that ordinary folk like them are excused from doing what he did because they haven't got his reason. He had no reason. He had a cold thing in his channel and a fire in his house, and a law that said the cold thing wasn't a person. And he looked at the law and looked at the thing holding on with its hand. And he decided the law was wrong and the thing was a child. And then he made it true with his own name on a line, because he was a keeper, and a keeper keeps what the tide brings in. That's not a reason. That's just a man. And the terrible thing, the thing the asking folk can't carry, is that any of them could have been that man, and weren't, and he was, and that's the whole of the difference, and there's no easy answer in it anywhere. The tide's turning. The marks'll be going under soon. I have a bell to ring.